if I'm successful in this race, really my highest priority is going to be to open new emergency housing and shelter. Homeownership is out of reach. Rent just goes up and up. Childcare is so darn expensive. And we just can't have a good city. We can't have a thriving city if the people who work in the grocery stores, the people who work in the coffee shops, people who work, as janitors and security guards in our office buildings downtown cannot afford to live in the city where they work.
We are pleased to be joined by Katie Wilson, a leading candidate for mayor in Seattle, an election that is just now around the corner, so I'm sure everyone's excited. I want to first thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Great to be here, Brandon.
Yeah, and the pleasure is all ours. So homelessness is obviously a major issue nationwide, and I'm sure in Seattle it's no different. So I want to start there. How do you plan to deliver on affordable housing in ways I'm sure you believe your opponent has failed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we do have a really serious homelessness crisis here in Seattle. And in fact, it's a lot worse here than it is in most places around the country. I believe we actually have the highest levels of unsheltered homelessness in Seattle compared to any city in the country. So it's really bad. And it's gotten a lot worse over the last 4 years of the current mayor's term, unfortunately. And that's really one of the big reasons why I'm running. I think what we've seen over the last 4 years is that our shelter capacity hasn't expanded. We have 2 homeless people in Seattle for every 1 shelter bed. And so the current mayor's administration, their policy has basically been sweeping people around the city from spot to spot without actually offering, meaningfully offering shelter or support. And so if I'm successful in this race, really my highest priority is going to be to open new emergency housing and shelter and be able to actually welcome people inside because we just can't have another 4 years where we have thousands of people sleeping on the street. One thing in Seattle is we have this new Seattle social housing developer that voters have twice now in a landslide said that they want our city to develop permanently affordable, publicly owned, mixed income housing. And our current mayor has been opposed to that project. And I'm a big supporter. So that's another big reason why I'm running is that we really need to get as much housing as possible out of the private market and into public hands so that we can have permanently affordable housing because housing should be a human right. It shouldn't be a commodity that only the well-off can afford.
Yeah, and so in getting that kind of social housing built, is the, I guess, hurdle, so to speak, is it just having a mayor that supports it? Is it kind of like the funding? Is it a red tape kind of stuff? How do you get it done when you're in office?
Yeah, great question. So we have this new developer, right, which was approved by voters a couple of years ago. This February, we had a measure on the ballot that it was a grassroots campaign that people gathered signatures for that was for a funding source for that new developer, basically to fund it by taxing our wealthiest corporations. And this is actually really the reason why I jumped into this race is that measure passed in a landslide. I was supportive. Our current mayor was supporting an alternative measure, which was really kind of to undermine that social housing developer and not to pass that new tax. So the funding is there and it's going to start coming in soon, but it really is going to require a strong partnership, active leadership from the mayor's office to make this project work, right? The city needs to work with the developer to identify good land, good sites, buildings for acquisition for that new developer. And it is also about cutting that red tape, right? Making sure that the permitting process goes fast, and potentially even using the city's like bonding capacity, right, and credit ratings so that we can get a lot of money up front to really get the housing going with a lot of units right up front.
When you talk to people in Seattle as you've been campaigning, what issue do you hear the most? And then how would you directly kind of address that for the people where you're hearing it from them?
I mean, I will say that affordability, I think, is the core issue that so many working people in our cities are facing right now. And this is really, I think, what is powering my campaign. And I think looking at obviously Zohran Mamdani's campaign in New York City, right, is really based around affordability. And, it's just at this point where not just very low income people, but people who consider themselves middle class, people who have, what are considered decent jobs are just struggling to make it in the city. There was an article in the Seattle Times recently basically showing that the median income for a married couple with children in Seattle is now over $250,000. And they stop even publishing the exact number at that point. And so what that tells you is that for working people with children, it is just not affordable to live in the city until people move out, right? Like homeownership is out of reach. Rent just goes up and up. Childcare is so darn expensive. And we just can't have a good city. We can't have a thriving city if the people who work in the grocery stores, the people who work in the coffee shops, people who work, as janitors and security guards in our office buildings downtown cannot afford to live in the city where they work. So that is just something that so many people are feeling right now. And that is going to be one of my very highest priorities as mayor, is to tackle that affordability crisis with everything I've got.
Another thing that kind of goes into, I guess, just community as a whole is public transit. Could you explain why that's such an important topic for Seattle, and then how you plan on making it safe and effective?
Yeah, so I'm a big transit rider. My family doesn't have a car, so and I have a 2-year-old, and so I'm always on the buses and the trains with my toddler. I love it. She loves it most of the time. Um, and so it's so important that we have a true mass transit system, right? Seattle should be a world-class city. And we have a growing region. People are going to continue moving to Seattle, and we just have this kind of geometric problem, right? We can't keep expanding our roads. We can't keep expanding parking spaces. And so as more people move here, we need to make it possible for more and more people to live without a car, and to live, or to at least to live without driving all the time. And of course, this is also part of the solution to our climate crisis, right? And so it is so important that we're improving our public transit system. And that means, more bus service, better bus service, building out our light rail system. And there's a lot that the mayor can do on that front, right? We actually have a measure funding bus service that's up for renewal next year. So there will be the opportunity to potentially expand that. Another thing that I really support is legislation. This would be first in the nation, legislation that would require at least large employers to actually subsidize transit passes for their workers. Because if you look at the situation right now, right, if you work for a tech company or a lot of mostly higher paid jobs, you get a fully paid transit pass as a perk of your job. But if you work as a barista at Starbucks or a checker at the grocery store, right, or a hotel worker, chances are you're not getting any kind of transit benefit. And you're an essential worker. You're a worker who has to be there in person every day. And so it's an equitable policy, and it's also a policy that can get more people riding our public transit system. So that is something that I would like to put forward if I'm successful in this race.
Yeah, and then I guess when it comes into things like housing and transit, obviously funding is probably one of the first questions people have. And on your website, you talked about progressive revenue. I looked at, I think Washington was bottom 3, bottom 2 in terms of a regressive tax state. I live in Indiana, so I understand the perils of regressive taxation. Could you explain kind of your plan to shift the tax burden off of the lowest earning Americans in Seattle and fund these kinds of programs?
Yeah, totally. And this is really this is something that I've done a lot of work on over the years, right? When I first started as a community organizer back in 2011, that was a time when our transit system was in danger of being cut deeply. And so I and the organization that I co-founded, the Transit Riders Union, we did a ton. We're just what's going on? Why is this the case, right? And it turns out that our transit system, and really all of our local governments and state government in Washington State, were very dependent on sales tax, which is very regressive, and property tax, which is kind of mildly regressive. And yeah, we've had the most regressive tax system in the country in Washington State for a long time. We're now number 2 behind Florida. And the reason why we're now number 2 instead of number 1 is that in the past few years, we had a state capital gains tax passed. And then in Seattle, we had the Jumpstart Seattle payroll expense tax, which I helped to design and pass. And that is a tax on our wealthiest corporations based on basically payroll to high paid employees. So it's a very progressive tax. So we're making a little bit of progress, but we definitely have a ways to go. And we also know that we need more revenue, right? We have to use the revenue we have effectively, but also especially to deal with our housing crisis, especially to build out our transit system, right? There's a lot of needs still there. And also just in the context of the Trump administration potentially, cutting funding, that's going to impact Seattle. And of course, we're just about to see November 1st, probably a lot of people's food stamp, SNAP benefits ending because of the federal shutdown. So we need to make sure people don't fall through the cracks. So in terms of raising new progressive revenue locally, I definitely support a local capital gains tax. So we could basically add on a little bit to our new statewide capital gains tax just for Seattle. That could raise some new revenue. Potentially, we could raise some more revenue through the Jumpstart tax that I mentioned, right, on big corporations. And there are some other a little bit out of the box options that I think the city needs to do some work to develop. So one of those is a vacancy tax, which Basically this would, if you have a vacant, could be commercial property, residential property, basically incentivizing the good use of property, so we don't have just like speculative investment in property that then actually isn't used and just ends up being vacant. And then that could also raise some revenue. So that's one that I support. Also, a digital ad tax is something that a few states and cities around the country have either done or are looking at. And that's kind of getting at the fact that we have these social media companies that are profiting off of our attention all day, every day, with often really bad impacts, right, on our mental health, and on our information ecosystem. And so if we can find a way to get at that, that's another way that we could be raising some revenue as well. So also just fighting at the state level for more progressive revenue options, because we're somewhat constrained at the local level. And fighting for, a wealth tax has been on the table at the state level the last couple sessions. So that's something we need to keep fighting for as well. Ultimately, we should have a progressive income tax in Washington State and in Seattle. And that's a big multi-year project that, I've been involved in and will continue to push for as mayor.